Had been a salvage runner for 15 years. He knew every trick in the book. He knew which auctions were real and which ones were traps set by pirates. He knew how to spot a deal and how to walk away from trouble. So when he saw the listing for a space station selling for 1 credit, he laughed out loud. Someone's having fun with the system, he muttered to himself, scrolling past it on his. But something made him scroll back. The listing was still there. A Helix-class station, origin unknown, location in the deep outer reach. The price was 1 credit, not 1,000, not 100, just 1. There was no reserve, no hidden fees, no catch listed in the fine print. Had learned long ago that if something looked too good to be true, it usually was. But he also knew that sometimes, just sometimes, the universe threw you a bone. He had found his ship, the Patience, in a junkyard where someone had mislabeled it as scrap. That find had changed his life. Maybe this would too. He spent 3 days checking the paperwork. The station was real. It sat in legitimate space, registered to a mining consortium called Industries. The company had gone bankrupt 30 years ago, and all their assets had been liquidated. This station had been sitting on the auction block ever since, passed over again and again because of its location and condition. The location was bad. 3 weeks from the nearest shipping lane, out in a part of space that nobody visited because there was nothing there worth visiting. The condition was worse. Life support was failing. Power systems were degraded. No one had set foot inside for 40 years. But the real reason nobody wanted it was in the historical notes. Read them 3 times to make sure he understood. 40 years ago, the crew of the station had abandoned it, all of them. In the middle of a normal shift with no warning and no explanation, every single person on board had launched themselves in emergency pods and fled. They left behind personal belongings, half-eaten meals, and jobs half done. When rescue ships picked them up, none of them could explain why they had run. They just said they had to leave. They said something was wrong. They said the station felt alive. Most of them had spent time in psychiatric facilities afterward. A few had never recovered. The company had sealed the station and written it off as a loss. And there it had sat for 4 decades, waiting for someone brave enough or stupid enough to claim it. Entered the bid. 3 months later, his ship dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the coordinates listed in the auction documents. The station hung in the void before him, dark and silent against the stars. It was big, much bigger than a standard Helix class, with sections that curved and bent in ways that seemed wrong for human engineering. Had seen a lot of stations in his time. This one made him uneasy in ways he could not explain. "Well," he said to himself, "I paid a whole credit for you. Might as well see what I bought." He docked the Patience at an airlock that still had power and stepped inside. The darkness was absolute. His helmet lamp cut through it, but the light seemed to stop short, as if the shadows were pushing back. The air was breathable according to his sensors, cold and thin but safe enough. Frost covered every surface. His boots crunched on it as he walked. The corridor ahead was wrong. It curved when it should have been straight. The walls were covered in patterns that looked like manufacturing defects at first, but the more looked at them, the more intentional they seemed. They swirled and twisted like something organic, like veins under skin or branches on a tree. "What the hell is this place?" he whispered. He followed the corridor toward what his station map said was the command center. The map had been part of the auction documents, showing a standard Helix-class layout. But the station did not match the map. Corridors went where none should be. Rooms were too large or too small. It was as if someone had taken a normal station and twisted it into something new. Was not easily scared. He had faced pirates and radiation storms and the cold death of vacuum. But walking through those dark corridors, listening to the silence press against his ears, he felt something he had not felt in years. He felt like prey. The command center door was open. It should have been sealed after the evacuation, but it hung ajar, frost covering its edges. Pushed it open and stepped inside. His lamp found the body immediately. It was slumped against a console in the center of the room, tall and thin and utterly alien. Its limbs bent in too many places. Its skin, if it was skin, was gray and smooth like stone. It had no face that could recognize, just a smooth surface where features should have been. It was dead. It had been dead for a very long time. Stood frozen, his heart pounding. He had heard stories about first contact, about the three species humanity had encountered since leaving Earth. All of them had been hostile. All of them had led to war. But this creature was none of them. This was something else, something unknown, something that had no business being on a human mining station in the middle of nowhere. His lamp drifted down to the floor. There, carved into the metal with deep gouges, were words, not alien symbols, English words formed by a hand that should not have known them. "Thank you for coming. We have been waiting." Read the words 3 times. His mind tried to make sense of them and failed. This creature, this alien thing, had written in English, had written a message meant for whoever came next, had waited, dying, for someone to find it. He thought about leaving. He thought about going back to his ship, flying away and never looking back. That was the smart thing to do. That was what the crew 40 years ago had done. That was what any sane person would do. But was not leaving. He knelt beside the alien body and looked at it more closely. Up close, he could see details he had missed before. The smoothness of the skin was not uniform. There were patterns on it like the patterns on the walls, swirling and complex. The limbs, bent at impossible angles, were positioned as if the creature had been reaching toward the console when it died, reaching for something, trying to do something. "What were you doing?" asked out loud. His voice sounded strange in the silence. "What were you trying to tell us?" The console flickered, jumped back, his hand going to the pistol at his hip. But the console was just running on failing power, lights blinking in random patterns. Or maybe not random. Maybe there was something there, some message trying to get through. He spent the next 6 hours exploring the station. He found more of the aliens, dozens of them in a chamber deep in the station's core. They were suspended in pods that hummed with faint power, their bodies preserved in some kind of stasis. Most of the pods were dark and dead, their occupants long gone, but some still had lights, some still had power. Some of them were still alive. Stood in front of those pods for a long time. He counted 7 that still functioned, 7 beings from a species no human had ever seen, sleeping in the heart of a station that should not exist. They had been here for decades at least, probably longer. They had been here before the mining company came, before humans even knew this part of space existed. The station was not a station at all. It was a ship, their ship, and humans had built a mining facility around it without ever knowing what they had found. Thought about calling for help. He thought about reporting this to the authorities, to the military, to someone who would know what to do. But he knew what would happen if he did. He had seen what humanity did when it found something it did not understand. It destroyed it or studied it to death. It took and never gave anything back. These beings had waited for someone. They had carved a message in a language not their own, had left a trail of breadcrumbs for someone to follow. And was that someone? He had paid 1 credit for this station, and he was starting to understand that price had been set by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. "All right," he said to the sleeping aliens. "I don't know who you are or what you want, but you asked me to come and I'm here. Let's figure this out together." He walked back to his ship and began to unpack. He was not going anywhere for a while. Over the following weeks, learned the shape of the station better than he knew his own ship. He mapped corridors that curved through dimensions that should not exist. He found chambers filled with technology so advanced it looked like magic. He discovered a library of crystal spheres that glowed when touched, filling his mind with images and concepts that slipped away like dreams upon waking. The mining company had barely scratched the surface. They had built their facility in one small section of the hull, never realizing how deep the ship went, how much it contained. walked through halls that echoed with something older than Earth, and he began to understand why the crew had fled. The station was not hostile, it was not haunted or cursed, but it was alien in the deepest sense of the word. It operated on principles that human minds were not built to grasp. Walking its corridors felt like trying to read a book written in a language you almost understood, where every page almost made sense but never quite did. It was maddening. It was beautiful. And loved it. He had spent his whole life looking for something like this. He had searched junk heaps and ruins, had sifted through the garbage of a dozen civilizations, always hopping to find something that mattered. Something that would prove the universe was bigger and stranger and more wonderful than anyone believed. And here it was, a ship from somewhere far away, crewed by beings that had crossed the void to watch the stars. They had come here for a reason and was going to find out what it was. He started with the console where the dead alien had been found. The creature had been reaching for it when it died. That meant something. Cleaned the frost from the controls and studied them for hours. They were not designed for human hands, but they were designed for hands of some kind. He could work with that. It took him 2 weeks to figure out how to turn it on. When he did, the entire station woke up around him. Lights flickered to life in corridors that had been dark for decades. Systems hummed with power that seemed to come from nowhere. And a voice spoke in his mind, gentle and warm and ancient beyond measure. "Welcome," the voice said. "We have waited so long." Smiled in the darkness of a ship that was finally coming alive. "Tell me everything," he said. And the station began to speak. The station's voice was not a voice at all. It was more like a presence, a gentle pressure in its mind that carried meaning without words. At first it hurt. His head throbbed and his vision blurred every time it tried to communicate. But the presence was patient. It adjusted itself, lowered itself until it could understand. The beings called themselves the Keepers. That was not their true name, which was a concept too complex for human minds to hold, but it was close enough. They were archivists, collectors, scholars who had spent millions of years gathering knowledge from across the universe. They had visited 10,000 civilizations, had watched species rise and fall, had recorded everything they found in their great library of crystal spheres. And they had come to this galaxy because of humanity. "I don't understand," said out loud. He was sitting in the command center, surrounded by screens that displayed information in patterns he was only beginning to recognize. "You came here for us. Why?" The presence showed him. It was like watching a movie inside his head, but more real than any movie had ever been. He saw the Keepers in their home galaxy, surrounded by stars older than Earth's sun. He saw them detect a signal from across the void, a radio wave carrying music and voices and images. He saw them analyze it and realize what they had found. A species that had gone from stone tools to radio waves in less than 10,000 years. A species that changed faster than anything the Keepers had ever seen. A species that burned so bright it lit up the dark between galaxies. Humanity. The Keepers had launched a ship. They had crossed the unimaginable distance between galaxies, a journey that took longer than human civilization had existed. They came to watch, to learn, to add humanity to their archives. They were not conquerors or invaders. They were simply curious, drawn by a light that shone brighter than any they had seen. But something went wrong. Their ship was damaged during the crossing, its systems failing after so long in the void. They crashed here in this empty part of space and entered hibernation while their ship tried to repair itself. They expected to sleep for a few decades. They slept for millions of years. When humans finally found them, the Keepers were dying. Their hibernation pods were failing one by one. The one who had woken when the mining crew arrived had used the last of its strength to try to communicate, to reach out, to explain. But the humans had looked at it and seen only something alien, something wrong, something to fear. They had fled. And the Keeper had died, but not before leaving a message. A message in the language of the species it had crossed galaxies to find. A message for whoever came next. Sat with this knowledge for a long time. He thought about the crew who had run away. He thought about all the times humanity had encountered something new and responded with fear and violence. The war, the conflict, the crisis. Every first contact in human history had ended in blood. But not this one. This time someone had stayed. "What do you need?" asked the presence. "How can I help?" The presence showed him the hibernation chamber. 7 pods still functioned, 7 keepers still clung to life. But their systems were failing. Without repairs, they would die within a decade. The ship had the knowledge to fix itself, but it needed hands to do the work. It needed someone willing to learn. Had never been an engineer. He had never been a scientist or a technician. He was just a salvage runner, a man who picked through garbage for a living. But he was also stubborn, curious, and completely unwilling to watch 7 beings die when he could do something about it. "Teach me," he said. The presence seemed surprised. The keepers had watched many species, had seen many individuals. Few of them would have made the choice was making. Most would have called for help or run away or tried to exploit what they had found, but just wanted to fix things. He wanted to help. "Very well," the presence said, "we will teach you." The lessons were hard. The technology was nothing like anything had seen before. It operated on principles that made his brain hurt to think about. But the presence was patient, breaking down complex concepts into simple steps, guiding through repairs that should have been impossible for human hands. He cannibalized his own ship first. The patience had parts that could be adapted, modified, repurposed for alien systems. Stripped her down to the frame, sacrificing his way home without hesitation. He could build a new ship later. Right now, there were lives to save. Weeks turned into months. Stopped tracking time by Earth standards and started measuring it by repairs completed. He fixed power conduits and life support systems. He stabilized hibernation pods and rerouted failing circuits. He learned to read the alien displays and understand the alien technology, his mind stretching to accommodate knowledge it was never designed to hold. The presence guided him through everything. It was gentle but relentless, pushing him to learn faster, work harder, think bigger. Sometimes got frustrated. Sometimes he shouted at empty rooms, angry at problems that seemed impossible to solve. But he never gave up, and the presence never lost faith in him. "Why me?" asked one day, covered in grease and exhausted from hours of work. "You waited all this time. You could have written that message for anyone. Why did you wait for me?" The presence considered the question. It showed him images of the auction listing, sitting on databases for decades, waiting for the right person to find it. It showed him the calculations the dying keeper had made, trying to figure out what kind of person would buy a station for 1 credit. Not someone rich, because rich people did not need bargains. Not someone desperate, because desperate people would sell what they found. Someone curious, someone stubborn. Someone who would look at a mystery and refuse to walk away. Laughed. You were waiting for an idiot with no sense of self-preservation. The presence did not disagree. As the months passed, began to understand more about the keepers and their mission. They had visited thousands of worlds, had watched thousands of species rise and fall. Most of them followed predictable paths. They developed technology, spread across their home systems, and then either destroyed themselves or settled into stability. Very few ever made it beyond their own galaxy. Very few even tried. But humanity was different. Humanity was fast, chaotic, unpredictable. They had gone from horses to starships in the blink of a cosmic eye. They changed so quickly that even the keepers, who had watched the universe for millions of years, could not predict what they would do next. This terrified most of the galaxy. The keepers had passed through regions of space where humanity was spoken of as a plague, a virus, a threat to be contained. Species that had existed for eons watched this young race with fear and hostility. But the keepers saw something else. They saw potential. They saw a species that might one day reach across the void as they had, might one day add their own knowledge to the great archive. They saw hope. The hope was fading now. The keepers were dying, their ship failing, their mission incomplete, but was here and was working, and maybe that was enough. Maybe one stubborn human with grease on his hands could make a difference. A year after he had arrived, finished the repairs on the first hibernation pod. The system stabilized, the lights turned green, and the keeper inside opened its eyes. It was the most alien moment of his life. The being that looked at him was nothing like him. It had no face, no eyes in the human sense, but it saw him nonetheless. It reached out with a limb that bent in impossible directions and touched his hand. The presence in his mind shifted. It was no longer just the ship speaking to him. Now there was another voice, weaker but distinct. The keeper was communicating directly, adding its own thoughts to the flow of information. Gratitude, surprise, wonder. The keeper had expected to die. It had gone to sleep knowing that its species was fading, that their mission was ending, that everything they had worked for was slipping away. And now it woke to find a human standing before it, a representative of the species they had crossed galaxies to find. "Hello," said, feeling ridiculous. "What did you say to a being that was millions of years old?" I'm here to help." The keeper's response was not words but a feeling. It was warmth and hope, and something like laughter. It was the first good news the keepers had received in longer than human civilization had existed. Over the following months repaired the other 6 pods. One by one the keepers woke. They were weak, diminished shadows of what they had once been. But they were alive and they were together and they had a new friend. They began to teach him in earnest then, not just how to repair their ship but everything. They opened the library to him, showed him the crystal spheres and how to read them. Each sphere contained the knowledge of a different civilization, distilled into pure information. Medicine, technology, mathematics, philosophy. The accumulated wisdom of millions of years gathered from across the universe. Spent hours in the library, lost in wonders he could barely comprehend. He saw the rise and fall of empires that made human history look like a footnote. He learned mathematics that revealed the universe as a pattern of breathtaking elegance. He touched spheres that contained art and music from species that had been extinct for eons. And through it all, he thought about what this would mean for humanity. The knowledge in this library could change everything. It could cure diseases and end poverty and push humanity to the stars faster than anyone imagined. But it could also be used for war. It could be hoarded by the powerful, exploited by the greedy, twisted into weapons that would burn worlds. "What do you want me to do with this?" asked the keepers one day. "I can't keep it to myself, but I'm scared of what will happen if I share it." The keepers considered his question. They had watched many species face similar choices. Most of them made the wrong decisions. Most of them destroyed themselves or each other, their potential squandered in conflict and fear. But the keepers had also seen species that chose differently. Species that had looked at great power and decided to use it wisely. Species that had reached out instead of lashing out. It was rare, but it happened. They believed humanity could do it too. They believed this because of. Was not special, the keepers told him. He was not the or the strongest or the most important human alive. But he had done something remarkable. He had looked at something alien and frightening and unknown, and he had chosen curiosity over fear. He had stayed when others ran. He had worked when others would have given up. If one human could make that choice, then maybe others could too. "You're putting a lot of faith in my species," said. The keepers agreed. They had crossed galaxies on faith. They had slept for millions of years on faith. Faith was all they had left. Thought about it for a long time. He thought about his life as a salvage runner, searching through garbage for treasure. He thought about the crew who had fled this station, too scared to stay and learn the truth. He thought about every war and every mistake and every wrong choice humanity had ever made. But he also thought about the good things, the kindness and the courage and the endless, stubborn refusal to give up. Humanity was flawed, but it was also capable of amazing things. Maybe that was enough. Okay, said, let's figure out how to do this right. The keepers gathered around him, and they began to plan. 2 years after bought a space station for 1 credit, a ship departed from the outer reach and headed toward the central systems of human space. It was not the Patience, which had been stripped for parts long ago. It was something new, built from human salvage and alien technology, carrying 7 beings that no human had ever seen and 1 man who had become their friend. Sat at the controls, his hands steady on instruments that were half familiar and half strange. The keepers rested behind him, conserving their strength for what was to come. They were still weak, still recovering from their long sleep, but they were determined to see this through. The plan was simple. They would not announce themselves with fanfare or approach the governments and militaries of human space. That would only lead to fear and conflict. Instead, they would start small. They would find others like people who could look at the unknown and choose wonder over fear. They would teach them, guide them, and slowly spread the knowledge of the library throughout human civilization. It would take decades, maybe centuries, but the keepers were patient. They had waited millions of years already. What was a little more time? As the ship traveled through the void between stars, thought about everything that had led him to this moment. A 1 credit auction listing, a dark station full of mysteries, a message carved in metal by a dying alien. Every choice he had made, every moment of doubt and fear and determination had brought him here. He did not feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had stumbled into something bigger than himself and decided to do what he could. That was all anyone could do, really. Find the problem in front of you and try to fix it. Reach out when it would be easier to run away. Thank you, he said to the keepers, for trusting me, for believing we could be better. The keepers responded with feelings rather than words, warmth, hope, gratitude. And something else, something that took a moment to understand. Pride. They were proud of him. This species that had watched the universe for millions of years, that had seen empires rise and fall, was proud of 1 salvage runner who had refused to give up. Smiled and turned his attention back to the stars. Ahead of them the central systems were waiting. Earth was waiting. The whole of human civilization was waiting, unknowing, for a gift that would change everything. The keepers had crossed galaxies to find humanity. They had believed, even when their ship was failing and their people were dying, that this strange, chaotic, beautiful species was worth the journey. And now, against all odds, their faith was being rewarded. Knew it would not be easy. There would be fear and resistance, and people who wanted to use the knowledge for war. There would be setbacks and failures and dark moments when it seemed like nothing would ever change. But there would also be moments like this one. A ship flying toward hope. 7 ancient beings and 1 stubborn human, working together to give the universe something new. The knowledge of 1,000,000 years, offered freely to anyone willing to learn. The keepers called themselves archivists, collectors of knowledge from across the stars, but was beginning to understand that they were something more. They were teachers, gardeners, tenders of potential. They found species with promise and gave them the tools to reach their full potential. They had done it many times before. And now they were doing it for humanity. As the ship flew on through the endless dark, thought about the message that had started it all. The words carved into metal by a being that had waited millions of years for someone to come. Thank you for coming. We have been waiting. He understood now what those words really meant. They were not just gratitude or relief. They were an invitation, a welcome, a promise that whatever came next, humanity would not face it alone. The stars stretched out before them, countless points of light against the void. Each one was a possibility, a potential, a place where life might one day flourish. The universe was vast beyond comprehension, and most of it was empty and dark. But not all of it. Here and there, lights burned in the darkness. Species reached out across the void, looking for connection, for meaning, for something to believe in. The keepers had spent millions of years finding those lights and nurturing them. Now humanity was one of them. Thought about all the people back on Earth in the colonies, living their lives without knowing what was coming. Soon, everything would change. They would learn that they were not alone in the universe, that beings of unimaginable age and wisdom had crossed galaxies to find them. Some would be scared, some would be angry, some would refuse to believe. But some would look up at the stars and feel what it felt when he first stepped onto that dark station. Wonder, curiosity, the irresistible pull of the unknown. Those were the ones who would carry the torch forward. Those were the ones who would take the knowledge of the keepers and build something new. Not just technology or medicine or science, but a new way of thinking, a new way of being human. It would not happen overnight. It might not happen in his lifetime, but it would happen. He was sure of it. The keepers had believed in humanity enough to cross galaxies, believed in them too. He had seen the worst of his species and the best, the fear and the courage, the darkness and the light. And he knew, deep in his bones, that the light would win. The ship flew on, carrying its cargo of hope toward a future that no one could predict but everyone would help create. Behind them, the empty station waited in the dark, its corridors silent, its mysteries revealed at last. Ahead of them, humanity waited, the universe waited. And the keepers smiled, and added one more entry to their endless archive. The entry was simple, just 2 words, written in a language that had traveled across galaxies and millions of years to reach this moment. Humanity worthy. It was the highest praise the keepers could give, and it was only the beginning.